Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 6 February 2025. It is the 98th anniversary of the birth of Leon J. Goldstein, who was born in Brooklyn, New York on this date in 1927. It's almost inevitable that when a discipline is stuck in a rut that involves a fundamental bifurcation, someone is going to come along to offer a third way that tries to avoid these well-worn ruts. The two ruts I have in mind are analytical philosophy of history and speculative philosophy of history, which is a distinction that has been drawn by several philosophers, each in slightly different ways. William Drey called this the distinction between critical and speculative philosophy of history. Maurice Mandelbaum called this the distinction between formal and material philosophy of history. And Arthur Danto called this the distinction between analytical and substantive philosophy of history. Each of them defined the distinction in subtly different ways, so there's a little bit of wiggle room as to how exactly these concepts coincide, if they do indeed coincide. But Goldstein doesn't take his conception of a critical philosophy of history directly from Drey, Mandelbaum, or Danto, but rather from Henri-Irénée Marrou, whose book, The Meaning of History, Goldstein cites. I'd previously heard of Marrou only once before finding Goldstein's citation of his book. Marrou isn't well known in the Anglophone world, and many of his books have not been translated to English. The Meaning of History, published in French originally in 1959, was translated into English in 1966, but is not widely available, and I don't have a copy of it myself. It opens with a chapter on the critical philosophy of history, where he says, quote, "Our concern is to develop a critical philosophy of history, which will be a reflection on history devoted to the examination of logical and gnosiological problems that arise from the historian's line of thought. It will enter into that philosophy of the sciences whose legitimacy or fecundity no one today would question. It will be in the same relation to the philosophy of history as the critical philosophy of mathematics, physics, etc., is to Naturphilosophy, which in Romantic idealism was developed in a way that was parallel to the philosophy of history, as a speculative effort to penetrate the mystery of the universe." Unquote. This and several other passages in Marrou's book tip us off to the fact that the critical philosophy of history that Marrou wants is not exactly the critical philosophy of history that Drey contrasted to speculative philosophy of history. And it's this conception, Marrou's conception of a critical philosophy of history, that Goldstein takes up as his own. Goldstein wrote in his book, Historical Knowing, quote, "What interests Marrou is the formation of collective facts. They are certainly not to be found in any document and cannot be established by means of the critical analytical procedures his two predecessors described. Since they are not dug out of documents, they are presumably constructed by historians in some other way, and it is the function of critical philosophy of history, in Marrou's sense, to determine how this is done." Unquote. And this is more or less Goldstein's point of departure. He didn't explicitly go after the distinction as formulated by Drey, Mandelbaum, and Danto to try to show that that distinction is misconceived or misleading, but he opened his book, Historical Knowing, with a declaration that makes it clear he's doing something different. Goldstein began the book, quote, "History is an epistemically licit discipline which deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms," unquote. And just a little further on, he elaborates on what he means by this. Quote, "One feature of history which I think creates a prima facie case for taking it seriously as a licit way of knowing is the extraordinary amount of agreement as to the character of the human past that history has managed to achieve under what are clearly epistemologically unpromising conditions. Perhaps it is more interesting to attend to the disagreements among historians, and we can learn a good deal about the theoretical and ideological conflicts of an age when we attend to the ways in which historians disagree. Yet it would be a mistake to overlook the fact of widespread agreement, both as to what the human past was like and to what the methods are in terms of which we may expect to learn about that past. Unquote. The critical philosophy of history that came out of the Anglo-American analytical tradition sought to bring history and its methods before the bar of epistemological inquiry. Goldstein flips the script on this presumption and says that agreement among historians implies the validity of historical methods, and a critical philosophy of history should try to come to an understanding of how this is the case. So history isn't to be judged and reformed by philosophy. Philosophy is to account for the fact of historical knowing, which Goldstein believes to be a reliable form of knowing. Even though Goldstein has taken Marrou as his point of departure and his orientation within critical philosophy of history, he stakes out his own position. And though he believes that the work of historians has justified the historians' methods, he wants to inquire into those methods and understand them, not try to justify them, but understand from a philosopher's and epistemological point of view how these historical ways of knowing are reliable ways of knowing. And he writes, quote, "If it is the case that much of the outcome of historical research is reported in the form of accounts written in non-technical language, it is not the case that history is not a technical discipline. The mistake of so many writers on philosophy of history is to think that history is a form of communication or a mode of discourse," unquote. The latter interesting claim, that history is not a mode of discourse, puts Goldstein at odds with Hayden White, who is a close contemporary of Goldstein, born the year after, who has been far more influential than Goldstein has been. I didn't record an episode on Hayden White last year, although I should have, as his influence has seeped far beyond philosophy into wider currents of postmodernism, not only interpreting history, you could say, but actually shaping history by becoming a force in contemporary thought. Goldstein was also interested in the fact that history, like philosophy, is carried out in ordinary language, but it is nevertheless what he calls a technical discipline. Quote, "History is a technical discipline in the sense that it uses methods which are particularly, or I should say peculiarly, its own. History is a way of knowing, not a mode of discourse. And the proper point of departure of a critical philosophy of history is not the finished product of historical writing, but that way of knowing and its technique," unquote. The fact that critical philosophy of history should not address the finished product of historical writing, that is to say, the historian's completed prose narrative, but the way of historical knowing by which the historian comes to produce his finished product, is the basis, or part of the basis, of Goldstein's criticisms of Arthur Danto. I said earlier that Goldstein got his conception of critical philosophy of history from Marrou and not from the contrast between analytical and substantive philosophy of history in Danto and other analytical philosophers of history. But Goldstein was aware of Danto's distinction and of Danto's conception of an analytical philosophy of history in contradistinction to a substantive or speculative philosophy of history, and he was critical of Danto on this point. I could still reasonably argue that Goldstein's point of departure and his conception of critical philosophy of history has little to do with the distinction between analytical and speculative philosophy of history. I could say that the division between analytical and speculative philosophy of history isn't really a fundamental bifurcation in the philosophy of history, as I implied in my opening when I said that philosophy had basically gotten stuck on two ruts. And when that happens, you're going to find somebody who's going to try to get outside of those ruts. But I still want to place Goldstein's work in this light, and I try to explain why that is the case. The earliest books that I would consider to embody the spirit of analytical philosophy of history were Georg Simmel's The Problems of the Philosophy of History, which was originally published in German in 1892, so very late in the 19th century, and Raymond Aron's Introduction to the Philosophy of History, an essay on the limits of historical objectivity, originally published in French in 1938. Simmel kept writing and rewriting his book on history, and the later versions are quite different from the earlier versions, but it does represent a new impetus in the philosophy of history, quite different from what had heretofore passed for philosophy of history in the 19th century. Interestingly, Raymond Aron also wrote a book that could be titled in English, Essay on the Theory of History in Contemporary Germany, The Critical Philosophy of History. And this was published in the same year as his better-known work on philosophy of history in 1938. The other book hasn't been translated to English, but in it, Aron also is concerned with a critical philosophy of history. Aron's conception of this is as follows, quote, "The traditional philosophy of history finds its completion in Hegel's system. The modern philosophy of history begins with the rejection of Hegelianism. The ideal is no longer to determine at once the meaning of human development. The philosopher no longer believes himself to be the repository of the secrets of providence. The critique of pure reason forbade the hope of accessing the truth of the intelligible world. Thus, the critical philosophy of history renounces the attempt to attain the ultimate meaning of evolution. The analysis of historical knowledge is to the philosophy of history what Kantian criticism is to dogmatic metaphysics," unquote. This was written 20 years before Marrou's book. I've said earlier that Marrou was the influence on Goldstein for critical philosophy of history. And Aron has explicitly and rightly connected the growing interest in a critical philosophy of history with a rejection of Hegel and Hegelian philosophy of history. Again, interestingly, Aron's positive conception of what a critical philosophy of history should be is closer to the Anglo-American conception of Drey, Mandelbaum, and Danto than the conception of Marrou and Goldstein, since Aron sees the task of critical philosophy of history as the analysis of historical knowledge. Goldstein accepts the idea of critical philosophy of history as the analysis of historical knowledge, but as I said, he flips the script on what most analytical philosophers were doing. What would later be called analytical philosophy of history came to be heavily influenced by analytical philosophy in the form of logical empiricism, which was admittedly already passé by the time of Danto published his Analytical Philosophy of History in 1965, which was later rewritten and retitled Narration and Knowledge in 1985. And Danto was himself no logical empiricist, certainly not in the narrow sense, but he had picked up enough of the spirit of the enterprise that he was as much on board as any other analytical philosopher, which comes out in his criticisms of substantive or speculative philosophy of history, which was Danto's way of distancing himself both from Hegel and from metaphysics. Goldstein says, however, that Danto's discussions, quote, "are really no part of a critical philosophy of history," unquote. There are criticisms throughout Goldstein's book, Historical Knowing, that connect Danto to an alternative conception of critical philosophy of history. Quote, "The proper task of a critical philosophy of history is to tell us about how the presently practiced discipline of history carries out its work and whether or not a discipline which carries out its work in the ways that this one does may be reasonably expected to produce claims to knowledge that are responsible and warranted. Alternative conceptions of the tasks of a critical philosophy of history seem considerably less promising. One may wish to discuss that which turns out to be merely logical to be the merely logical possibility of knowing about the human past, but to show that such knowledge is logically possible, or that, along the lines of Arthur Danto, it does not conflict with our ordinary conceptual system, is not to show how such knowledge is to be had, unquote. Goldstein's historical knowing was published originally in 1976, and then he published The What and the Why of History, Philosophical Essays, in 1996, and this is a collection of 19 previously published papers, all on philosophy of history. The What and the Why of History includes Goldstein's 1991 paper, Historical Being, which is, we could say, explicitly metaphysical. And as such, it constitutes another illustration of how Goldstein's conception of critical philosophy of history doesn't seek to avoid metaphysics. And this distinguishes Goldstein from most 20th century analytical philosophers of history. I could even say it's an ontological approach to philosophy of history, but argued after the manner of analytical philosophy of history. And in this way, Goldstein is carrying on the earlier tradition of Simmel and Aron, who pursued post-Hegelian philosophy of history without any of the ideological commitments of logical empiricism. In this paper, Historical Being, Goldstein repeats his claim from historical knowing that it's not the finished product of the historian's work that ought to interest the philosopher, but the process of historical knowing itself that is what matters. Quote, if we attend to what goes on while the historical work, the genuine creative historical work as referred to above, is being done, one sees something else entirely. It is because what he does leads the historian to say something in particular, that he is led to say something subsequent. Should it turn out that that something subsequent cannot be said, the evidence makes it difficult to say, then the historian may have to rethink the plausibility of the first thing, unquote. So after showing his willingness to engage in an explicitly metaphysical philosophy of history in Historical Being, Goldstein is mindful that his position will be characterized as a kind of anti-realism, but the way he frames this suggests that he didn't want his views pigeonholed in this way. Quote, there is nothing I could say along the lines I am pursuing here that would dissuade realists from thinking that my view is arbitrary given the realistic tendency to take its stand with reals, which are independent of the ways in which knowledge of them is acquired. Nevertheless, I should want to say that historical facts come into being in the course of historians' work. This involves the application of historical method and historical thinking to the data, evidence, that historians use. One might say that the evidence is, in fact, the point of departure for the historian's work, but that suggests that first the evidence is piled up and then the task begins. The fact, however, is that how the evidence is piled up, what evidence belongs with what other evidence, is itself the outcome of historical research, and so I shall not put it that way, unquote. I have to observe here that Goldstein's argument is continuous with the immediately previous quote and the earlier quote, distinguishing the finished product of the historian with the reasoning that brings the historian to his account that becomes the finished product of his work. For Goldstein, it really is historical reasoning and historical knowing that is the heart of the problem. Goldstein seems to be tentatively feeling his way toward an elusive conception of the metaphysics of history, but he doesn't yet have the conceptual framework for this, and adopting the familiar conceptual framework of analytical philosophy of history would box him into a position he doesn't want to take. And we can easily see the dangers here. If we say that historical facts come into being in the course of the historian's work, we're in danger of collapsing the familiar distinction between res gestae and historia rerum gestarum that we've seen in several episodes, for example, the episodes on Giovanni Gentile and Michael Oakeshott. all idealist philosophies of history are in danger of conflating past actuality with the record of past actuality. And Goldstein is alive to the danger, hope to avoid it, but I think his formulations are still somewhat tentative in nature. So happy birthday, Leon Goldstein, and thanks for listening.